I'm Lisa Genasci, I'm CEO of the ADM Capital Foundation. We're going to try and run through this in about an hour, so hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. We're going to have Sophie and Sam Inglis from ADM Capital Foundation presenting, along with Justin Gosling from the UK, also presenting this evening. ADM Capital Foundation, as most of you know, is a largely environmental foundation established 13 years ago by the partners of ADM Capital, which is a Hong Kong-based investment manager, just for those of you who do need some background. And as you are likely also aware, Hong Kong plays a significant role in the illegal wildlife trade, which is large by volume through our city and contributes to a global crisis in species extinction. ADMCF has, in the last few years, built a wildlife trade program, which we initiated by pulling together the Wildlife Trade Working Group, which is now an aggregation of about 50 people and organizations, mostly based in Hong Kong. Collectively, through research, education, and action, last year we achieved a progressively phased ban on ivory in Hong Kong and increased penalties for Appendix 1 and 2 species seized in Hong Kong. What we don't yet have are clear investigative powers and mandate for the Security Bureau to investigate beyond the carriers transporting wildlife products. And that's something that we hope to achieve. In general, wildlife crime in Hong Kong is not treated as serious crime, despite its social, economic, and environmental impacts. And there is a lack of support for investigations of people, materials, in connection with organized crime. This leaves little capacity to prosecute those behind the networks and syndicates that take advantage of Hong Kong's position as a major trade hub. And despite the increase in penalties, the judiciary and its prosecutors remain uninformed, we find, and the public continue to be unaware of wildlife criminality in Hong Kong. So ADMCF is working through various means, including research, broad education for government, the judiciary, to have the relevant provisions of CAP 586, which is the Wildlife Ordinance, placed under OSCO, which is the Organised and Serious Crimes Ordinance. That is the objective of our work at the moment. And as part of this effort, in January 2019, ADMCF published Trading in Extinction, the Dark Side of Hong Kong's Wildlife Trade, which documented the findings of research undertaken by some members of the Hong Kong Wildlife Trade Working Group led by ADM Capital Foundation. This report for the first time illustrates the extent and nature of the wildlife trade and of wildlife crime in Hong Kong. And it demonstrates what happens in Hong Kong matters, and that is, and not only that the trade, not only is the trade illegal and illegal wildlife at a significant and unsustainable scale, but it's likely to get worse looking forward. In this webinar, ADMCF's Sophie and Sam, whose bios you have in the materials that you've received, I hope, will present the key findings of the new report. And Justin Gosling, as I mentioned, law enforcement and criminal justice consultant, will provide context for the Hong Kong wildlife trade action. Together, we aim to highlight for you all the urgency and continued need to combat the illegal wildlife trade through Hong Kong. Before I hand over to Sophie, though, a couple of housekeeping issues. If you have questions, please type them into the chat function, and we can try to address these at the end. Please feel free to jump into the discussion once the question has been asked if you don't feel that the response was adequate. We do want this to be a discussion at the end if possible. And finally, please do keep yourselves on mute when not talking. So over to Sophie. I will be sharing the screen here, and she will let me know when she needs the new slide.
Right, so thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon and good morning and good evening, depending on where you are. So time and again, Hong Kong is cited as a global wildlife trafficking hub, yet the full extent of the trade and the nature of the associated criminality is not particularly well understood. We're most familiar with relatively frequent press releases in Hong Kong announcing notable seizures and occasionally successful prosecutions. However, these are just a sample of the consignments seized and the cases brought to courts. Over the past couple of years, we've assembled and analysed publicly available data regarding this situation. The resulting report endeavours to, firstly, highlight Hong Kong's disproportionate role in global wildlife trafficking, to demonstrate that wildlife-related crimes in the city are in many cases organised and serious in nature, and to make the case that if the illegal wildlife trade is to be addressed globally, Hong Kong, like many jurisdictions, needs an enhanced enforcement strategy that goes beyond the current regulatory regime. Ultimately, that what happens in Hong Kong matters. Next slide. To understand the extent and nature of the illegal wildlife trade, we reviewed and analysed data from 4 sources. Firstly, government data was collated on 379 wildlife seizures from press releases, departmental annual reviews and reports, direct communications, customs notice of seizures. Secondly, as Hong Kong's role in the wildlife trade isn't limited to just seizures within or at its borders, we also undertook a rapid review of media reporting of seizures in other jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Thirdly, we wanted to understand how Hong Kong is treating wildlife offences in the courts, so we've been documenting and attending as many court cases as possible over the past 18 months or so. And finally, we reviewed a slew of investigative reports, academic research and international prosecution data to ascertain links with Hong Kong and organised criminal activities. During this process, a wide range of experts have been consulted, both in Hong Kong and from around the world, including academics, law professors, barristers and conservationists, and including those on the front line in source countries. Next slide, please. The seizure data is broken down into 16 parameters and 10 broad taxonomic categories. This data collectively comprises what we've called the Wildlife Product Seizure Database, or WIPS. The report then focuses on the years 2013 to 2017. However, we're continually updating the research, and we've included some preliminary stats from 2018, 2019 for this webinar. So I'm just going to pass on to Sam, who will go through the key findings from the research.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So turning to the findings of the report, wildlife crime in Hong Kong is evidentially organised and serious. Seizures have demonstrated that the trade is transnational, high volume, lucrative, and ecologically impactful. Further, the networks of poachers, traffickers, retailers, and consumers involved have proven resourceful and capable, exploiting multiple entry and exit points in Hong Kong, and have attempted to evade detection through innumerable concealment methods. Hong Kong's position and interconnectivity have made the city a base for trading wildlife. At least 2/3 of the world's countries have traded threatened wildlife with Hong Kong, with our data revealing that at least 45 nations have done so illegally. Next slide, please. Hong Kong's footprint is disproportionate. For example, seizures of pangolin scales in Hong Kong since January 2018 through to mid-February of this year, just 14 months, amounted to 26.3 metric tons. Now that's 6 metric tons more than the UNODC accounted for in its worldwide database, which recorded seizures between 2007 and 2015. Next slide, please. Now, the IUCN estimates that a pangolin is poached every 5 minutes, and the volume of pangolins seized in Hong Kong indicated that pangolins are being poached roughly every 25 minutes to supply Hong Kong's illegal traders alone between 2013 and 2017. And this rate, as we will see later, is now markedly higher. Next slide, please. This now infamous picture is just some of the bodies of approximately 4,000 pangolins that are defrosting after they were seized, having been from a shipping container at the port of Sumatra in Indonesia. Next slide, please. For those who may be less familiar with the pangolin, they are traded overwhelmingly for their scales for use in traditional Chinese medicines. Next slide, please. In terms of seizures, our research indicates high frequencies and high volumes. Customs made 2,011 seizures between 2013 and 2017. And please note on the graphic, 2018 is shown for your reference. And this is roughly equivalent to the seizure of an endangered wildlife product every 21 hours. As you might expect, wood species, indicated in dark brown, dominated by weight. As already mentioned, pangolins, in orange, have been traded in enormous volumes, with authorities seizing over 40 metric tons. Ivory, in light brown, was also trafficked in large volumes with nearly 20 metric tons being seized over the study period. Next slide, please. Government statistics also indicate a 4th category of endangered species. These are aggregated under other species in blue and comprised innumerable valuable and critically endangered wildlife, including rhinos, totoaba, plowshare tortoises, golden coin turtles, helmeted hornbills, amongst many others. And prior to the creation and analysis of our WIPS database, there has been very little information in the public domain that has clarified what these other species might be, or the volumes in which they've been trafficked. And understanding the illegal trade in these less charismatic or well-known species is vital to empowering conservation efforts and preventing criminal syndicates from eradicating entire species for profit. Next slide, please. Turning to the values, between 2008 and 2017, the value of seizures made by customs in its enforcement of the Protection of Endangered Species Ordinance, CAP 586, increased 1,600%. According to customs annual reports, the value of endangered species seized under CAP 586 consistently ranked within the top 5 of the 56 ordinances which customs acts upon. Next slide, please. The value of individual seizures are also demonstrative of the lucrative nature of the trade, the proceeds of which are likely to fund further criminal activity. Our data indicates that a minimum of 56 seizures of wildlife were valued in excess of 1 million Hong Kong dollars. Of these, 23 were valued at over 5 million Hong Kong dollars, and a single seizure of rosewood was valued at 40 million Hong Kong dollars. Next slide, please. In terms of ecological impact, at least 59 species of wildlife have been seized, including 30 species of live threatened turtles and tortoises in just 39 seizures. The diversity is indicative of the reach of the wildlife syndicates engaged in poaching and trafficking. Next slide, please. And seizures we reviewed over the 5 years represent the equivalent of 51 rhinos, over 3,000 elephants, and between 10,000 to 64,500 pangolins, depending on the species. It's also worth noting that in 2018 through till the end of February, the volume of pangolins that were seized may represent as many as 44,600 pangolins, which is equivalent to one pangolin poached approximately every 13.6 minutes. Even when the numbers involved may appear small, they can be ecologically significant. For instance, a seizure of 10 critically endangered Madagascan ploughshare tortoises represented nearly 2% of the ploughshare's entire wild population at that time. And as of 2016, there were, quote, less than 100 adults left in the wild, end quote. And we also need to remember at this juncture that our data is just a snapshot based on 379 seizures. Next slide, please. Into 2019, the situation remains concerning, with exceptionally high and record seizures of rhino, pangolin, and ongoing large shipments of CITES-listed wood and live reptile species. And that's just based on the first 4 months of 2019. Next slide, please. The abilities of these syndicates to source so many species, especially those from remote regions, is also indicative of the level of organization involved in preparing these illegal shipments. Genetic analysis has shown that elephants and pangolins seized in Hong Kong have been harvested from across Africa and Asia, again requiring a high level of coordination. Next slide, please. The largest seizure on record comprised 1,008 metric tons of Malagasy rosewood that was imported in the hold of a cargo vessel that arrived from Zanzibar. Given the quantity involved and the intercontinental transit route, it is impossible that this volume of wood could have been coordinated and transported without a network. By volume, containers have unsurprisingly dominated, with at least 415 metric tons of illegal wildlife arriving by sea cargo container. By number of seizures, the Hong Kong International Airport has been an obvious hotspot. Next slide, please. But seizures aren't just made where customs are ready and waiting. As this map illustrates, seizures are taking place throughout Hong Kong, with smuggling syndicates notably exploiting coastal regions. Next slide, please. Hong Kong as a hub for all kinds of goods and services has huge amounts of traffic entering, passing through, and exiting the city, which has made the task of regulating our free port an almost impossible task for customs officers. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, not enough is being done with the existing resources. For example, we've repeatedly seen concealment methods that demonstrate a level of organization and coordination. Now, 37% of all pangolins that were seized between 2013 and 2016 were concealed under waste plastic. And we've seen this methodology being used again and again through 2018. Next slide, please. Numerous wildlife trafficking networks have also been identified as operating within and through Hong Kong. Of those wildlife criminals prosecuted in other jurisdictions, such as by the US Fisheries and Wildlife Service through Operation Crash, many have been found complicit in multiple additional and parallel crimes. Investigations have exposed conspiracy, smuggling, money laundering, use of false names and addresses, and the falsification of declarations. A now familiar case from January 2018 highlights the Hong Kong-linked Zhao Wei transnational criminal organization, which was described by the US Treasury Department as engaging in, quote, an array of horrendous illicit activities, including human trafficking and child prostitution, drug trafficking, and wildlife trafficking, end quote, in Laos. Next slide, please. Wildlife crime in Hong Kong predominantly manifests as illegal cross-border trade. Thereby, most criminals breach the Protection of Endangered Species Ordinance and the Import and Export Ordinance. However, other offences in Hong Kong include illegal possession under Cap 586. It should also be noted that local regulations have left opportunities for laundering of wildlife products through legal markets, with examples including seahorses, humphead wrasse, shark fin, pet tortoises and turtles, and, until 2021, ivory will remain at risk. Next slide, please. This brings us to the prosecution of wildlife crimes. Out of the 379 seizures, 165 were known to have been prosecuted. Seizures involving ivory had the highest level of prosecution at 79%, and this is most likely due to people being caught red-handed with the ivory on their person at the airport or in their baggage. Indeed, 78% of successful prosecutions were of air passengers, and 81% of the 182 air passengers arrested were trafficking in ivory. Of particular note is the low level of prosecutions relating to pangolin seizures. Of the 26 pangolin cases identified in whips, which comprised 43 metric tons in total, only 5 were prosecuted, and 1 of these resulted in an acquittal. There are also very few prosecutions observed relating to cargo containers. And that's despite 50 seizures from containers with a combined estimated value of 216.4 million Hong Kong dollars. Only 2 prosecutions were observed. It's also worth noting at this point that one of Hong Kong's largest ivory seizures, which took place in 2017 and comprised in excess of 7 metric tons of ivory, the case was dropped due to insufficient evidence, and the case has purportedly been closed. Next slide, please. Regarding sentencing, the financial penalties and custodial sentences have appeared at odds with the values and volumes under consideration. Admittedly, very little is known about most cases, especially those before the establishment of ADMCF's court observation program. However, the sentences being handed down appear unlikely to serve as a deterrent. Next slide, please. Since 2013, we have observed 15 seizures that have been prosecuted in relation to rhino horn. And although we're seeing some improvements in sentencing, it should be noted that in Hong Kong, the penalty for illegal rhino possession has been as high as 9 months, which contrasts quite significantly with countries like Zimbabwe, where you would typically get around 9 years. Next slide, please. According to WIPS, for the 99 cases where both fines and seizure values were available, the total of the pecuniary penalties amounted to less than 18% of the total estimated value of the products. So that's contrasting recovery through fines of 5.2 million, contrasted with wildlife products that were valued in excess of 30 million Hong Kong dollars. I'd like to hand back to Sophie at this juncture.
Thank you. So I think in sum, my research indicates that firstly, the volume of trade, the value and the impact are significant and likely vastly underestimated. that Hong Kong remains an essential link in global trafficking supply chains, and that lack of deterrence characterizes Hong Kong's endangered species enforcement, and that fundamentally the traffickers are winning. Ultimately, Hong Kong remains a strategic location for disrupting wildlife trafficking. So what happens here really does matter globally. Yet it receives relatively little global attention other than media coverage for its seizures, the most consequential of which are not prosecuted. As a result, we and others are making a case for wildlife trafficking offences to be brought under Hong Kong's organised and serious crimes ordinance. This would provide a mandate to the Hong Kong police force to investigate. Currently, most cases rely on the Environment Bureau, who fundamentally lack capacity and training in investigation. It would create an enabling environment for investigations of syndicates rather than prosecuting air passengers, and it would facilitate the confiscation of the proceeds of crime. In that case, hopefully the 7 metric tons of ivory case, for example, would have much more likelihood of being prosecuted. Achieving this, however, requires a mindset change by the government and leveraging support from legislators. We are hoping to produce a white paper by early June to make a clear case. To support this, we need to raise public awareness in Hong Kong and globally. We are working with investigative journalists to gain attention for a new project which we're calling the Pangolin Papers, and we need to make a connection for the local community between what is happening in other countries and what is happening here, particularly with Africa. We are continuing to track seizures and to monitor the courtroom, and we continue to take opportunities to raise judiciary awareness. The elephant in the room, however, is traditional Chinese medicine and its role in driving demand for endangered species products, such as those which contain pangolin, tiger, rhino horns, seahorses, bear, to name a few. To this end, we are researching the Chinese pharmacopoeia to better understand the industry and its medicines. What is allowed, what isn't allowed, where there are trade description issues and legal loopholes. We need to understand consumers' attitudes and to work with practitioners in developing a strategy. Next slide, please. And then to wrap up, we also work on species-specific issues. An example here is sharks, where the illegal trade is incredibly difficult to regulate effectively and thus open to abuse. Next slide, please. This is largely because of the large volume of fins, 5,000 metric tons of fins imported annually into Hong Kong, and the subsequent difficulty in species identification. We are particularly concerned that the juveniles of some CITES-listed species are difficult to identify unless DNA analysis is used. We believe that juveniles are being traded in large volumes. We are currently funding scientific research on this with a view to recommending stricter regulatory controls for shark fins through Hong Kong. Next slide, please. And I think just to wrap up, John Scanlon recently, as many of you I'm sure saw, put out an interesting opinion on whether or not we should have a wildlife crime convention, because although CITES is good and it's the best we've got, it really isn't enough to tackle wildlife crime. And hand back to Lisa.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sophie. Thanks for the presentation. Next, we have with us Justin Gosling, as I mentioned, who's agreed to put a bit more context around the situation in Hong Kong and the urgency that we feel to act. So, Justin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to ADM Capital Foundation for inviting me to say a few words. My name's Justin Gosling. I'm an independent law enforcement and criminal justice consultant. I have been working a life of crime for about 27 years, of which half was as a police officer and police detective in the UK, and for about the last 13 or 14 years been working mainly on trafficking in Southeast Asia and Africa, and mainly wildlife trafficking. I didn't work on the ADM report, but I've studied it with interest, and also been to Hong Kong to discuss some of the findings, so what I'm about to present are my findings on, or observations on the report, and putting it into context in terms of regional wildlife trafficking. So next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about is Hong Kong potentially being a transit country or a hub. We tend to categorize countries in the field of illegal wildlife trade into either source, transit, or destination countries. And it could be argued that the wildlife seized in Hong Kong is merely en route to mainland China or other destinations, and the authorities are doing a good job in intercepting those shipments and preventing them from reaching that final destination. But transit countries are rarely that. Invariably, they're almost certainly going to be involved in the import of the commodity, and then to some degree maybe processing of the item. So for example, carving of ivory or rhino horn, repackaging it, redistributing it, marketing it either through physical or online markets, and then of course the export to other countries either in a wholesale way or selling it to individual consumers. It's likely, therefore, that if a country is a so-called transit country, that it's likely that individuals controlling trafficking are going to be based in one of those countries, and therefore so is also a lot of the illicit income from that. So the first observation I made from seeing the Trading and Extinction report was that Hong Kong is clearly a hub for wildlife trafficking. In other words, it's in the center of it, it's highly significant, and certainly couldn't just be considered merely a transit country. Next slide, please. So one of the most shocking revelations from the report I found, and I know the previous speakers talked about the pangolins, and this isn't just about pangolins, but as a good example. The estimate was that the amount seized in the last few years is some 52,000 pangolins worth of scales, possibly up to 64,000 pangolins. And of course, there are several species in the illicit trade chain that would be extinct with that volume of trade. And unfortunately, it's looking as though we are nearing the end of the line for pangolins as a species globally with that volume of trade. But the volume of pangolin trafficking highlighted indicates that somebody in Hong Kong is orchestrating the trafficking in pangolin scales, because it's unlikely that they would be based somewhere else. I appreciate that's a bit of an assumption, but seeing the volume of the trade does indicate that Hong Kong and probably the individuals in Hong Kong are playing a significant role. And so it's essential to identify the trafficking networks and close down their activities. Otherwise, the imports of the wildlife will just keep coming and coming. Next slide, please. Now, the report focuses quite strongly and understandably on seizure data, often because that's mostly what's available. A lot of it is open source. And certainly in the field of wildlife trafficking, we do focus very strongly on seizures. So I just want to say a few things about that. The first thing is that seizures are a poor indicator of the actual total trade. It's likely that the actual volume being trafficked through Hong Kong is several times higher than the quantities being seized. So those 64,000 pangolins worth, it's likely to be a lot more than 64,000. And the total volume of traffic going through that's not being seized, of course, ensures profits for the entire network. So in other words, the quantities seized in Hong Kong are likely to be the tip of the iceberg. The second issue with seizures is that they don't provide very much information on whether the enforcement agencies are doing a good job. Is an increase in seizures due to better risk assessments at borders and ports and better detections, or is it that the number of smuggling attempts is actually higher or the volume of wildlife trafficking has increased? And it's difficult to say that for sure just from the number of seizures or the seizure volume. But certainly seizures that don't lead to any subsequent criminal justice response may indicate significant gaps in the enforcement response. In other words, if you're just making seizures, but you're not actually following up through a criminal justice process, that's not a particularly holistic enforcement process. The last point I want to make about seizures is that they don't stop wildlife crime. Seizures of dead wildlife aren't a success story. They shouldn't be portrayed as one. They achieve virtually nothing in preventing future offences and may in fact drive further poaching. I often make the example that if you lost your mobile phone down a drain tomorrow and couldn't retrieve it, first thing you'd probably do is go and buy a new mobile phone. And this is what wildlife trafficking networks are doing. If their commodities are seized, they then have to replace that in order to make their money at the end of the day. So they're probably just going to order wildlife and more wildlife to be poached. The other thing is that doesn't seem to be any correlation between the huge volumes of wildlife we see seized week after week, year after year, and any change in the trafficking. In fact, we're seeing larger and larger seizures all the time. Next slide, please. So how do we deal with this? If seizures aren't good enough, what do we need to do? So essentially what we need is to increase our level of investigation of wildlife crimes. They should be investigated as major crime investigations with several officers involved with sufficient investigative skills to investigate the crime to the full extent necessary, gathering the maximum available evidence. One observation from the report was that 78% of prosecutions came from air passengers with contraband in their luggage or on their person, and just 1% of prosecutions came from container trafficking, despite the fact that container volumes accounted for the majority of the wildlife smuggled. And this indicates to me a fundamental lack of investigation. At the end of the day, catching a smuggler red-handed across the border doesn't require a great deal of investigation. Of course, I'm not suggesting it doesn't involve good risk assessment or good searching, for example, but it's a fairly straightforward case. On the other hand, investigating traffickers responsible for shipping through containers is more complicated, but is certainly within the capacity of Hong Kong law enforcement agencies. Next slide, please. We need to move to a point where investigations are more offender-centric, focusing on the perpetrators of wildlife crime, not the commodities or locations or values, but actually recognizing that it's individuals who are behind this trade. I'm aware of a case from 2017 in Hong Kong where a male was found to have 24 kilos of ivory in his luggage arriving from Jakarta. The Agriculture Department, AFCD, conducted the investigation in Hong Kong. The man was convicted and given a short prison sentence and a fine. But the seizure took place on the 14th of January and the conviction took place on the 16th of January. So I just wonder how much investigation could have been conducted in 2 days. It's virtually impossible to conduct a shoplifting investigation in 2 days, let alone an international wildlife trafficking case. So I wonder what inquiries were made with Indonesia to see this person's involvement, what inquiries were made into their travel habits, who else they're working with. And certainly when it comes to wildlife crime, people aren't working alone. It's virtually impossible to conceive that people would be processing these significant quantities of pangolin, ivory, tigers, rhino, acting alone. So there's bound to be more people involved in the network. So when we see individuals arrested smuggling commodities in airports, for example, there should be a wider investigation into who that person is connected to. Next slide, please. So the investigations do need to be proactive, which essentially means, getting up off your desk, investigating or exploiting intelligence sources, conducting surveillance, looking at online activity and controlled deliveries, test purchases and things like undercover operations. Although I would just add that undercover operations are used extremely rarely by law enforcement agencies, although they are used very commonly by non-government organizations. But the key thing with proactive or intelligence-led enforcement is that no one has ever been convicted or should have been convicted on intelligence alone. So in addition, next slide please, we need to conduct better reactive investigations, more crime scene centric investigations focusing on the evidence, so that when there's a seizure or a person is arrested, other actions take place such as cell phone, laptop analysis, looking into social media of the people involved to see who their connections are, looking at financial records and transactions, looking at CCTV. I often wonder when someone's arrested at an airport, if anyone looks at how they arrived at the airport, what car they used, did they take a taxi, did they arrive with anyone, did they receive anything, a lot of which could be captured on CCTV, for example. We need to do better interviewing of people, and I don't mean harsh interrogation, I mean better quality interviewing. And we need to use forensics, not just wildlife forensics where we're taking DNA samples from, say, ivory to see where the elephant lived, but actually looking at things like fingerprinting of wildlife commodities in the packaging. And these are all standard investigative leads conducted for serious crimes. These are bread and butter when it comes to investigating serious crime. Next slide, please. So, in order to do this kind of level of investigation, however, the police really must be the primary investigative agency for any form of serious and organised crime, of which we acknowledge wildlife crime is. Wildlife crime doesn't just take place at borders. It often happens, it's taking place in cities where financial transactions are taking place and commodities are being processed. So a key development that Hong Kong urgently needs to make in developing its response is to empower and dedicate resources to investigate the crimes, bring about prosecutions. And that really means that the police have got to be involved. And Hong Kong has one of the most advanced police forces in the world. So there's no particular need for significant capacity building, for example. It's something that they can do now effectively because they're highly experienced at investigating other forms of serious organised crime. The other advantage that Hong Kong has above some other countries, particularly in Asia, is that customs and the police fall under the Security Bureau. So it's essentially the same department. And that's unusual, but it's highly advantageous in ensuring cooperation between the police and customs. So in other words, there's one boss that covers both of those agencies. Customs could make a seizure and then hand the case on to the police for further investigation and international inquiries. Next slide, please. Just something on legislation, and I don't presume to be extremely familiar with Hong Kong legislation, but there are changes that could be made if wildlife crime was to fall under the Organised and Serious Crime Ordinance, OSCO. And one of the key changes that needs to be made is to ensure that there's legislation to seize the proceeds of crime, including assets gained by offenders, and also to use money laundering offences. And what this means is that if someone is handling the proceeds of crime, that can constitute a money laundering offence in addition to the predicate offence of wildlife crime. So potentially the legislation could include the option to convict someone of a wildlife crime offence and a money laundering offence, and then to seize the proceeds of crime, such as their car, their house, any other assets that they've got. And it's a trick that states are really missing, given that wildlife crime is such a significant acquisitive crime, one that people make money from, and could lead to a significant incentive for the state, i.e. they get to put money back into the state and potentially into conservation and better wildlife crime enforcement. And it's also a disincentive or deterrent to the offenders. So it's not just about going to prison, it's not just about fines, but it's actually about calculating the funds that offenders have made and taking them away. But of course, this kind of level of investigation, forensic accounting, etc., it needs a police response, a police-led response. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, I think we recognise that wildlife crime is invariably a form of serious transnational organised crime, but we shouldn't overstate these points. Ultimately, wildlife crime is local. It happens at a local level and a national level. And it is within the capacity of most national law enforcement agencies. And I mean, across the world, most law enforcement agencies can investigate this level of crime, and certainly they can in Hong Kong. I think it'd be great to see Hong Kong to start investigating and prosecuting wildlife crime as a form of serious crime, and not to be a country that's criticised for its response, but praised for its leadership, and be an example and a mentor to other countries in the region, and helping some of the developing countries to build their capacity, driving international cooperation, and really taking the lead on wildlife crime. The response to wildlife crime ultimately has to come from mandated law enforcement agencies, not NGOs, not IGOs, but to ensure a sustainable, consistent response, it must come from law enforcement agencies. And I think that given its role in the region, relatively small but significant changes in Hong Kong could prove very effective and achieve greater results nationally and regionally than perhaps investment in some other Southeast Asian countries. So thanks very much, and I'll hand back.
That's great, Justin, thanks. That was extremely interesting. And thanks again to Sophie and Sam also. Just before we open up to some questions, just to follow on from your presentation, Justin, obviously Hong Kong still denies that the Hong Kong government denies that the city is a hub for the wildlife trade. So given that context, I mean, what do you think would push them to really consider that investigation, police investigation, Security Bureau investigation would be relevant and even sort of valuable? What would make them see that wildlife crime was worth serious investigation? And a sort of corollary to that, do you know of any countries that are setting a good precedent for investigating containers, for example? So who could we model ourselves on, I guess, would be the question.
I guess the first one is you know, if you can't look at this volume of crime going through the country and think that Hong Kong has a problem, then I think there's a degree of denial there. You know, there's a reason why traffickers pick certain countries. They'll either do them because they're very weak or they're very strategic, and often a combination of the two. I just think the volume of crime going through Hong Kong indicates that it is a significant problem. But perhaps you know, the evidence isn't compelling enough yet, and there needs to be further research and potentially investigation to demonstrate, not just at a seizure level, a sort of data level, but actually, you know, evidence indicating the people behind the trade in Hong Kong. But that's maybe something for further down the line. In terms of good examples, I mean, in terms of investigating container trafficking, I do think it's a problem in most countries. I think there's a sense that a seizure is often the end of the line, and the job is done. That said, I have heard some good cases in Southeast Asia where there have been large seizures, and there's then been follow-up, for example, in between Southeast Asia and Africa, and that's been assisted by international partners who've managed to do that, not NGOs, but actually government partners who've managed to do some liaison. But an example of which might seem a little surprising to some people is China now has or for several years now have had an anti-smuggling bureau as part of their customs. It's kind of like a customs police, where if they make a seizure, they're empowered to go out and investigate within the rest of the country. And they've brought some prosecutions, and quite significant ones, in relation to ivory trafficking. So there are good examples out there that Hong Kong could follow.
Great, thanks. We have one question here, perhaps Sophie, for you. The question is, what happens to wildlife product after it's seized?
As far as we're aware, it depends on the actual product. Pangolin scales, our understanding is that the government destroy them. Ivory has historically been stored, but Hong Kong has had one ivory destruction, but not all of the ivory tusks that have been seized have been destroyed, so they must be being stored. And the same goes for rhino horn. The live animals are, where possible, they're repatriated. So the government works with an organisation here called Kaduri Farm Botanical Gardens, and they work with the government to try and find a conservation program where the animal has conservation value. And in many cases they do, because they're threatened. However, if a conservation program can't be found, then the animals are euthanized.
Super. And while we wait for other questions, if anyone else has a question, please put your hand up or speak up, and happy to ask it. Okay, Harriet, legal timber. Has Hong Kong been implicated in any investigations relating to wood products on sale in countries where illegal timber regulations are in place? EU, US, Japan, Australia. Sam, perhaps that might be one for you.
Sure, yes. So the case that we mentioned earlier relating to the 1,008 metric tons of Malagasy rosewood is certainly the most stark of those cases, because Malagasy rosewood, as the name indicates, comes from Madagascar, and the trade in that particular species has been very heavily regulated and totally banned in recent years. So there is no context in which that wood could have exited that country at that point in time legally. It's also worth noting that in that particular case study, there was a shootout at the port in Zanzibar as that ship was leaving the port. So you can tell that, you know, the organized groups that are involved in this are also willing to protect their goods quite serious. They're very serious about protecting their goods. And that was purportedly headed for factories up in Fujian. but there are relatively few wood cases that we have good details on. As we've identified in the report, I mean, rosewood is a great example, particularly on the volume side, but red sandalwood is also very heavily prized, and we see a huge amount of it traveling through Hong Kong. A lot of it arrives from, initially it was arriving in the earlier years of our study, it was arriving from India directly, which is where it's harvested. And then we started to see it being reportedly consigned from other countries like Bangladesh, I think the UAE, and other neighboring countries. So there was definitely this transition in the routes, it would appear, trying to obfuscate where these products were coming from. And red sandalwood has been, again, connected to criminal groups that are operating in India. And it was most likely destined for China because we've also seen a lot of seizures. So it comes into Hong Kong in containers, and the way that it's seized when it's outbound is typically on speedboats, which are making their way across the Pearl River Delta or across the rivers to the north.
Great, Sam. And another question for you, perhaps. So, I mean, I guess we've spoken a little bit about this already in the webinar, but perhaps you can just speak to how far into the supply chain investigations actually reach. I guess from Hong Kong, the answer is not very far, but perhaps you can address that question.
Sure, to a very, very minimal degree, because I don't think that the investigations do go particularly far. I think from the few court cases, I mean, I'm not the person who's observed most of the court cases, so it's a little difficult for me to speak with as much authority as some of my colleagues, but I think from what we have seen, there is a bit of a truncation of the investigation at the point of arrest. So as I think Justin was mentioning, it's these quick wins. It's, okay, I've caught this person red-handed. I'm pretty satisfied that I can prove in court that this individual was complicit in a crime. But we've got testimony from our court observations that even when these individuals, fearing for their life in some cases, have said, actually, there is somebody that I can implicate. I'm happy to work with the police or the authorities in some manner to help you capture this person who I'm acting on behalf of. From my understanding of the court cases, there's been limited interest in the few cases we're aware of to pursue it beyond the individual. And I'm guessing that that's because it's either in another jurisdiction, or the burden of proof might be difficult, or there's also a fear of losing the contraband, I guess, if they let it go beyond the individual that they've apprehended, and on to a potential consumer or another proxy.
Yeah, and just sort of following on a bit from Justin's presentation, well, all of your presentations really, as Justin said, seizures aren't necessarily an indication of the size of the problem. Sam, in your experience working on the wildlife trade report, what proportion of the wildlife illegally smuggled actually gets seized by enforcement authorities? I don't think we put a number to that in the presentations.
No, and I think actually putting a figure to it is incredibly difficult. I think in the presentation we did show there is that slide which illustrates exactly sort of the scale of the trade in Hong Kong, which is pretty indicative of how difficult it is. So I'll just bring it up on my screen, sorry. So we're talking about 20.8 million containers in a single year. And we can account for, I think it's less than 70, maybe it's 50. So we're talking about 50 containers out of 20.8 million containers a year. And sorry, the figure I'm quoting is over 50, and that's over a 5-year period. So for them to have caught that so few out of so many containers that are passing through the city, it's hard to believe that there are not more that are making it through. And I think, sorry, one thing I probably should indicate is with the Malagasy rosewood, we only know of one seizure that has been of that scale, the 1,008 metric tons of Malagasy rosewood. However, there's plenty of testimony from other NGOs, other researchers, other investigations that this type of shipment is not atypical. So the fact that we can only account for one coming in by this method of this scale from that country is not an accurate indication or representation of the scale of that trade. It's just one case where they got lucky, and it's presumably because the sailors on that ship were involved in a shootout in the country of origin or the country of consignment. So my suspicion is that, I mean, if we just take that as being a representative shipment, that's the largest shipment that we've ever seen seized in Hong Kong. And if there are more like that are making it through, that gives you some sense of the volume of the trade, and that's just one species.
Super. And just backing up a bit, because I think it's important again to emphasize the drivers of the trade, what's driving the trade through Hong Kong. Sophie, perhaps you could give us some perspective. There. We have a few questions around that area.
Yes, from what we've seen from the seizures, different drivers. For the first one is traditional Chinese medicine, so the pangolin, the rhino, seahorses. We didn't mention seahorses, but there's quite a bit of that being seized, and a massive trade of that in Hong Kong itself. That's pretty much for the traditional medicine industry. We've also seen a lot of live reptiles being seized, and amphibians, and that's the pet trade. Hong Kong has a thriving pet trade market, which is a bit surprising. And then, of course, you have the sort of home decor ornaments, where we have the ivory and to a certain extent some rhino horn sculptures. And then, obviously, the largest volume of wood is obviously furniture. So it's a cross-ranging. But Hong Kong itself, it's essentially what's being used in Hong Kong is mainly the pet trade and some traditional medicines.
And then I guess a follow-up to that from someone on the ivory trade. Since, of course, under the current new legislation, the trade will wind up in Hong Kong by 2022. Do we believe that will actually wind up domestic use in Hong Kong or consumption in Hong Kong?
I think it probably will. We've already seen a reduction in domestic consumption. The ivory shops are not openly selling it anymore. If you want ivory, even though there are still legal stockpiles available, it's actually quite difficult to get. I think they have to know you, so it's really not open to the general public anymore. So I think after 2022, I would expect that there will be far less demand in Hong Kong. China, however, might be a different matter.
And then, Justin, a question for you. You made the point that the increased investigation work needs to come from police, not from civil society, for it to be effective. So what would you say then, and there are a couple of other questions around this area too, what would you say then would be the role for civil society to play in pushing for change?
I think, I mean, maybe I need to clarify this a little bit, but I think that civil society can continue to do a lot of what it's doing, which is certainly campaigning for changes in terms of national legislation and response from law enforcement agencies, but also, as ADM's done, is presenting data and information and intelligence and evidence to not only national governments, but intergovernmental bodies and international conventions like CITES to demonstrate that there's a problem. The point that I was making, though, is that whilst NGOs in particular conduct investigations into wildlife crime, that falls into two categories generally. One is campaigning purposes, so demonstrating there's a problem and trying to bring about either policy or systemic change. But the other one that's happened much more in the last few years is NGOs conducting investigations into individual offenders, individual suspects, and then presenting that information. The point I want to make is that, or was trying to make, is that ultimately the response has got to be from the law enforcement agencies, that even if there's a short-term prosecution of an individual, that isn't necessarily sustainable. So it's a bit like a crash diet in a way. You know, it might have dramatic effects in the short term, but ultimately it's a long-term, sustainable, consistent approach that's better, and that's got to come from law enforcement agencies. So in terms of what NGOs can do, I think they can continue to do what they're doing, but maybe recognize what's going to make a difference in the long term as opposed to short-term gains.
Thanks. And then I guess we're sort of wrapping up here. We have a couple of questions on basically how to act to elevate the issue of wildlife crime in Hong Kong. And I guess I'll turn to the three presenters, Sophie, Sam, and Justin, to give us that one action that they would see would really make a difference in Hong Kong, what would really bring change in Hong Kong in terms of how the government perceives the wildlife trade, or how the judiciary might perceive the wildlife trade. What could happen here that would really sort of move the dial?
Okay, so it's not really one action for me. I think it's one of the comments is that Hong Kong people are generally not connected at all with the wildlife crime situation in Hong Kong, don't really understand the importance of Hong Kong and its role in facilitating these global supply chains, whether it's as a transit hub or whether it's a recipient and demand centre. And what we have seen in Hong Kong is that when the community support an initiative, a legislative motion change, it really, really helps, and legislators look towards the community. So it's very important to raise awareness of the local community. So to that end, you know, we've got a few things up our sleeve. We're going to, later in this year, we're going to really try and have some events, raise awareness, take virtual reality into the public, to put them in connection with wildlife in Africa, and to truly try and make the connection. And make them understand and facilitate the understanding that actually Hong Kong is a city that wildlife crime is proliferating in, and really is this something that they want for their city.
Sam?
Sure, yeah. So I think from my perspective, the broad request from my end would be for greater transparency, and that's in two parts. One, obviously, in producing our report, we searched extensively through many sources, as Sophie outlined in the presentation, but it was still incredibly difficult to get to the data that allowed us to make the statements that we did, which I think allow us to tell a very compelling story. They demonstrate the scale of the trade and the crime, and they're vital to informing the enforcement, but also the conservation in the home countries. And then the flip side to this is the transparency around the prosecutions. So we have had to set up a program where we are monitoring or observing what's going on in the courts, just to glean sort of the outcomes of these cases. And the government has stated publicly that it is committed to handing down these deterrent sentences. But I would argue that if nobody knows what the outcome of a sentence is, no matter how high it can't serve as a deterrent. So if they're truly committed to deterring people from committing crimes, then they have to be far more open, and they have to broadcast the sentences that they're handing down, which will both empower us, empower people conserving in home countries, in countries of origin, and also deter criminals from acting, potentially.
And Justin?
My ultimate solution is to ensure that the police are mandated to investigate serious wildlife crime in Hong Kong. It's serious transnational organised crime, and if it was any other crime, it would fall under the police. So why not wildlife? The advantage with Hong Kong is you've got an experienced, highly skilled, professional, well-funded police force, which is on the level of any other advanced police force in the world, really. So if the police were engaged, if the police were the primary agency to investigate serious wildlife crime in and through the country, that could make a huge contribution. But they've got to be mandated to do that. They've got to decide to do that.
Great. Well, thanks so much to our presenters, and thanks to you all for listening. As we mentioned, we do have a wildlife trade working group set up in Hong Kong. I'm happy to, if anyone's interested in following the progress of the group, happy to sign you up. We always look for people to work with us in Hong Kong. We believe that partnership collaboration is always the best way forward on any of these issues. We will be updating one other matter to just mention is that we will be updating releasing an updated report with 2018 data of wildlife smuggled through Hong Kong, probably June, end of June. Yeah, end of June. So stay tuned for more information from our end. And again, thanks for participating. And we'll do another of these soon. Bye all.